was a night, and we were walking under the stars, the black sky. And he looked up to the stars and he said, ordinarily, when we look to the sky and look to the stars, we think of stars as objects far out and vast spaces between them. He said, there's another way we can look at it. We can look at the vacuum, at the emptiness, instead as a plenum, as infinitely full rather than infinitely empty. And that the material objects themselves are like little bubbles, little vacancies in this vast sea. So David Bohm, in a sense, was using that view to have me look at the stars and to have a sense of the night sky all of a sudden in a different way, as one whole living organism, and these little bits that we call matter is sort of just little holes in it. He often mentioned just one other aspect of this, that this plenum, in a cubic centimeter of the plenum, there is more energy matter than in the entire visible universe.
David Bohm was one of the 20th century's most brilliant thinkers, a physicist, philosopher, explorer of consciousness, the man Einstein called his spiritual son, and the Dalai Lama his science guru. Bohm suffered rejection from the physics community, who seemed unable to accept his ideas, and exile at the hands of the American government, having been falsely accused, despite being acquitted, of being a communist. Bohm displayed a rare and maverick intelligence, daring to peer into a world considered forbidden, an undivided universe where everything is interconnected, including ourselves. This is Bohm's remarkable story, the story of his life and his explorations in physics, philosophy, and consciousness, and the search for unity and wholeness at the crossroads of science and spirituality. Since the dawn of man, humanity has been haunted with fundamental questions about the nature of existence. Who are we? Where did we come from? What is our purpose? What is reality? Our ancient ancestors saw spirit in everything, and as the ultimate source of everything. A sense of mystery was present. The quest for knowledge through science and spirituality were not separated.
Buddha himself expressed to his follower, monks, scholars should not accept his teaching out of faith, but rather thorough investigation and experiment. Therefore, we trained that way, always why? Not easily say yes.
While the big questions remain the same, science and spirituality have grown far apart. The world has fragmented. For many, life has lost its meaning, its purpose. Classical physics promoted mechanism by suggesting that everything should be predictable and controllable, to see three-dimensional space as absolute, time as a singular linear progression, and our sensory experiences as reality itself. But when one begins to understand the true nature of reality and our place within it, these assumptions become obstacles. The early 20th century witnessed fundamental breakthroughs, enabling mankind to perceive the nature of reality in a radically different way. Those breakthroughs were the birth of relativity and quantum theory.
I believe that quantum physics, when we understand it in a philosophically more meaningful way, like Bohm was trying to do, like I'm trying to do, like many people are trying to do, I think it's a revolution. It has radical implication about how we live our life, how we interact with the earth, how we interact with each other. And that revolution is unfinished.
Quantum theory was born around 1900. 1905 saw Einstein's theory of relativity. Then in 1925, Heisenberg looked into the heart of nature and created quantum mechanics. This was followed by Niels Bohr's Copenhagen interpretation, then quantum field theory. This was followed decades later by the famous theory of everything, when scientists started to believe that the end of physics was in sight.
1980s and 1990s, we developed something, approach called a theory of everything. That was going to resolve everything, but it somehow didn't quite work out. There's something missing. Maybe we should look wider.
And so physicists started to look again at the ideas of David Bohm. Forgotten for decades, could Bohm's ideas now hold the key to unraveling the mysteries of the universe? This film will look at the answers. But first, let's ask ourselves the basic question. What is quantum physics? Quantum physics is the description of the smallest things in the universe, the things that we do not see in our everyday world of space and time, such as atoms, molecules, and the tiny invisible particles which form the entire underlying structure of the universe. One grain of sand contains more atoms than all the sand on all the beaches on the planet. Quantum physics is also the basis for multi-billion-dollar industries. Every time you turn on your mobile or tablet, you are invoking the fundamental laws of the universe. It's a world that defies any description that is limited to ordinary space and time. The relationship of objects is not determined by their relative positions, but by relationships existing at a deeper quantum level that cannot be understood in our everyday world. It's a mysterious place where relative space collapses, linear time ceases to be. It's a timeless world, eternal. It's the intangible unmanifest that infuses all life. Everything in the known universe emerges from it. Everything we are and everything we do is dependent on it. While all this is incredible, the scientific orthodoxy had not been able to successfully reconcile the two big breakthroughs of the early 20th century, quantum mechanics and general relativity, into a unified theory. And so physics remained polarized. Its chief protagonist, Niels Bohr on one side and Albert Einstein on the other, unable to agree on what constitutes the true nature of reality.
Quantum mechanics is really about explaining the properties of the microscopic world, the materials our bodies are made of, our brains are made of at the very microscopic level. General relativity, or relativity theory in general, is about explaining the largest cosmic dimensions, space-time, gravity, the whole macroscopic order of the cosmos. And so you can imagine that this macroscopic cosmic level needs to be connected to this super subatomic quantum level. How can this be done? And the two theories describing these two realms really can't do that. And they have not been compatible with each other since their inception. And since quantum mechanics was developed, there was a tension between the two.
My interest moved more toward understanding the fundamentals of physics and quantum mechanics and relativity. And I became especially interested in how these fundamental theories are not clear, that their basic ideas are unclear and they contradict each other.
Bohm was thinking very deeply about that and said, okay, we don't need a new idea. We don't need a new theory. We don't need a new bit of mathematics, which everybody else was trying. What we need is a radically new order to physics. That's what we need, a new order.
With that absolute contradiction of the two basic theories, I said we could try to find out what they had in common. Now, what they have in common is what I call undivided wholeness.
So it was the idea that the whole is contained in each of the parts and the parts in the whole. And my feeling is that gave that insight to Bohm, that this world we live in, it's all hard and fast. The explicit order, this is the explicit order, is really just a surface order. It's not a deep, profound order, and there's something lies underneath it, which he called the implicate order. So the implicate order is not so much a set of objects, but a process. It's a process of constant movement, constantly unfolding and enfolding. So what we see as our explicit world is really the result of a process of unfolding and enfolding. So the explicit order comes out of the implicate.
David Bohm was dealing with general ideas. He would be dealing with philosophical ideas. We would go into language. Is language limiting the way we can express these ideas? He would go into biology and say, look, this is the way biological systems develop. Nature is surely more organic, and yet we're trying to do in our quantum mechanics is to make it mechanical. Perhaps we should move into that area and say that there is a more organic way of thinking about life in general. And then ultimately he became very fascinated with the role of consciousness in all of this. Where does consciousness come in? What is thought? What is thinking? And he would be discussing those and writing very profoundly about those ideas.
It was David Bohm who joined the dots. He provides both an elegant and coherent view of reality, allowing for something much more subtle to enter, in which manifest reality unfolds from a deeper order, suggesting that everything is internally related to everything else, and that each part of the cosmos contains the whole universe and unfolds into our perception of reality.
This sense of mystery in life, it takes the power away from our verbal intellectual framework. We still know how to think, we still see the world in a certain way, but it doesn't have the same power to grip us because we're entering the mystery of actuality.
That's the key. That's the deepest hidden level of reality, the gate of all wonders.
Exploring the philosophical implications of both physics and consciousness, Bohm's questioning of the scientific orthodoxy was the expression of a rare and maverick intelligence in which much of his most important contributions were expressions of inner feelings which date back to his early, unhappy childhood in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. David was born in Wilkes-Barre on December the 20th, 1917. A coal mining town, once the energy supplier of the world, it had been hit by a serious economic slump caused in large part by the declining use of coal as a source of fuel in industry.
There was a great deal of unemployment and suffering, and people were out of jobs and banks were failing. People were talking about things getting very bad, even revolution. And then Roosevelt came in and he produced all these new measures which gave people hope, you see, and I think they lifted things up a little bit. And
His mother was hospitalized on several occasions for mental illness, and his father was distant and disapproved of his son's interest in science, hoping instead that David would one day take over the family business. Life for the young David was not ideal.
Bohm was sort of unhappy. He was unhappy at home, unhappy with his father, who ran a used furniture sales shop. And Bohm, the ambition was that Bohm would own the biggest used furniture sales shop in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Bohm didn't want to do that. He wanted to explore ideas, and his father wasn't very happy about that. And he felt he lived in a rather brutal world. And one day he got hold of a science fiction story called The Skylark of Space, about a boy who travels off to other planets in a spaceship. That was his dream. If I can go to other planets, there'll be ideal worlds. So for him, this world we live in, this world of space and time, is sort of imperfect. It's an illusion. And beyond that is a much deeper reality. That was his school vision. And then as he grows up and becomes older, that becomes his vision of what he called the implicate order. That beyond the everyday Newtonian worldview, there's a much deeper order he called the implicate order. And that was what he was groping towards. How do we uncover this deeper order of the world?
His fragile nature caused him to be always in search of security, until one day, with a group of friends, he was forced to cross a stream by means of stepping stones.
I was with some boys and we were in the mountains near Wilkes-Barre, crossing a rather rapidly flowing stream, and there were a lot of rocks we had to cross on. They were rather far apart and very small, and you couldn't just step across them, and I felt very apprehensive. It seemed a new situation. But I suddenly realized you had to jump from one to the other without stopping in between, that you were in a state of movement, pivoting on one rock while you moved to the next. Whereas I'd usually thought of going from one step to another. I was mapping out the steps. After that, I felt that it made a deep impression on me that this theme has recurred a lot in my work, that your consciousness is going moment by moment of awareness and not mapped out.
Despite his father's disapproval of his interest in science, the young Bohm proved to be an exceptional student, writing his unified theory of the cosmos, one that integrated mind and matter while still at school. Having finished high school, the young Bohm moved to Penn State University, where he graduated with a physics degree. His exceptional ability in mathematics and physics secured him a scholarship to move to Caltech in California. There he met with Robert Oppenheimer, who was sufficiently impressed with Bohm to arrange for him to transfer to the University of Berkeley, where Oppenheimer headed up the physics department.
He became a student of Oppenheimer to do a PhD. And this was just before Oppenheimer went off to set up Los Alamos, the nuclear facility. So one day when Oppenheimer was going off to Los Alamos, Bohm would have liked to have joined him, but he couldn't get clearance, partly because he'd joined the Communist Party of America for 9 months, and then, but because of actually paying a fee, he got smeared with communism trait. But he said to Oppenheimer just before Oppenheimer went, "What am I going to do about my PhD?" He said, "I can't write the thesis because the papers have been classified." And Oppenheimer said, "Oh, okay, just let's get the papers, I'll give you a PhD." And so he left Oppenheimer with a PhD, but as it were, through the back door.
With a sense of rejection from his own father, Bohm had sought father figures, and it was clear that Robert Oppenheimer was to fulfill that role.
He was a father figure to Bohm, and a father figure that's going to ultimately do damage to him.
Far away from the narrow constraints of Wilkes-Barre, Bohm enjoyed his new social and cultural life. He actively explored philosophical, social, and political ideas and their wider implications as physical theories. But little did Bohm know that his early philosophical idealism, coupled with unfolding global unease, would have a dramatic impact on the trajectory that his life would take from now on. Oppenheimer had gathered around him a circle of exceptional research students. Oppenheimer himself supported communist organizations and groups. For Bohm, politics and physics were inseparable, and he soon discovered that several of Oppenheimer's students were interested in what they termed the Russian experiment, in which a Marxist society would lead to the transformation of the individual. This idea also played into Bohm's work in physics, where he saw parallels between the movement of electrons and the possibility of individual human freedom. This led Bohm to one of his most important early discoveries, the theory of the plasma in metals.
A plasma is called the fourth state of matter. There's gases, there's liquids, there's solids, and the fourth state is like a gas in which the gases are charged particles. So it would be a bit like what happens around the sun. You have a gas of charged particles. And in a metal, the idea was a metal, you'd have a lattice where all the nuclei are in the lattice, they're charged, and an electron runs through them. There's a gas of electrons running through. And Bohm's idea was, can I look at the gas? Can I find a theory for this gas? And what he found was that that the extent to which an electron participated in this gas, it became relatively free. So it went back to his old idea about the Russian experiment. To what extent, if I am a member of the collective, can I have individual freedom? It seems a paradox. If I'm a member of the collective, then I don't have freedom. I'm part of the group. But he found to the extent to which an electron participated in the plasma, it became free. It became free of the interaction of other electrons. So he began to see, yes, within the plasma, within the collective, there can be individual freedom. So it was both a theory of the plasma in metals and a theory of freedom in the collective.
Now, having set up that plasma physics, he was recognized by the people in Berkeley, and he was offered a job at Princeton University. Remember, Einstein was at the Advanced Study Institute, but he was offered a job at Princeton because they thought him a very talented young American physicist.
He went to Princeton and he took a room in a house next door to Einstein. So he met Einstein, they become close, he would go to Einstein. In the evening, Einstein would have German expatriates over playing the cello, violin, have concerts, and he would go to those and talk a lot to Einstein. Einstein said that he felt Bohm was his spiritual son.
In this period, Bohm also wrote a standard textbook on quantum theory, which presented the orthodox Copenhagen interpretation of the theory as outlined by Niels Bohr.
He then was asked to give a course on quantum mechanics, and he gave an orthodox course on quantum mechanics. At the end of the course, he thought, well, I don't really understand this quantum mechanics. So he said, the best thing to do if you don't understand something is to write a book. So he then wrote a book which he entitled Quantum Theory, which has a reputation of being one of the best books on quantum theory at the time. He was describing standard quantum mechanics, Bohr's point of view. He was trying to defend Bohr's point of view, had a lot of discussions about Bohr's point of view, as well as some very interesting applications of quantum mechanics. And it was there, by looking at Bohr, that he became very interested in this notion of wholeness, a notion which he carried into much more general situations as he got clearer and clearer how wholeness was arising in the quantum structure itself.
However, Bohm began to feel that something was not quite right about Niels Bohr's interpretation, believing that it placed a limit on what could be said about the quantum world. As we have seen, the quantum domain is the subatomic realm, the world of the smallest things in the universe, all that is invisible to the naked eye. Since the 1920s, there has been one experiment which it is said puts one up against all the paradoxes and mysteries of nature 100%. The experiment is the famous double-slit experiment. If we fire electrons through two slits, they start as particles, but instead of creating two distinct bands on the wall on the other side, they in fact create an interference pattern like waves. In an effort to decode this mystery, physicists decided to put a measuring detector by one slit. But when they did, the electrons did not produce any interference pattern. The act of observing collapsed the wave pattern. This mystery cuts to the heart of why Bohm began to differ in his views from Niels Bohr. Both Bohr and Bohm agreed in the essential wholeness of quantum theory. But Bohr believed the quantum world to be unanalyzable, that there can be no layer of reality beyond quantum statistics.
Bohr had this idea that we could not say anything about the underlying reality. And people have taken that also to mean that there may not be an underlying reality. Einstein completely disagreed with this point of view. He thought there must be an underlying reality, and this underlying reality would produce the effects that we actually see in our instruments. Now the question then was, what is that underlying reality?
Bohm was saying, yes, we can talk about quantum objects, we can talk about the quantum world, but the quantum world is radically different from the classical world.
What Bohm did when he came along was to be influenced by Einstein in a way that he also felt that there was something underlying the statistical features.
Bohm felt that something mysterious was happening. And the key for Bohm is that what we observe as distinct and separate in our everyday world of space and time is in fact connected and not separate at the deeper quantum level, because they are part of a single system where separation does not exist. But while Bohm continued to be preoccupied with such questions, his communist leanings, coupled with concerns at Los Alamos about possible leaks of classified information to the Russians, was to impact dramatically on his life within physics, and ultimately his own view of the scientific orthodoxy.
McCarthyism had suddenly come back to the fore with the Korean War. And McCarthy was trying to get people to testify against colleagues at Berkeley and Los Alamos. And David Bohm was asked to testify, and he refused.
He was asked to give names. He refused to give names. And as a result of that, he was arrested for contempt of Congress.
Then he was bailed, but very shortly after the bail, the High Court ruled that it was not unconstitutional to plead the Fifth, and so he was released. But because he had been enmeshed in this mess, the principal or the head of the university banned him from the campus. Einstein actually wanted him to become his assistant, but Oppenheimer objected. In fact, Oppenheimer saw Bohm in Princeton once and said, I thought I asked you to get out of the country because I think for your own safety you should leave the country.
And I know he did write to Einstein. Einstein tried to help him, but no. The only thing was to leave the United States and go to Brazil. So he had no future in the States. He just had to leave, and that was it.
Exile was a chilling experience. At Princeton, he had been surrounded by friends. His work on plasmas was recognized as significant. His book on quantum theory was considered the best. His continuing concerns about Niels Bohr's interpretation of the quantum world, in which Bohm responded with a more causal or realistic version of quantum theory, he put into a new paper which he called Hidden Variable.
Well, he had really questioned the orthodox interpretation of Bohr and Heisenberg and the Copenhagen interpretation, and decided to develop his own approach, which he called hidden variables.
In other words, the behavior of quantum particles were not chance processes, for the motion of electrons were guided by underlying pilot waves. When he finished his paper, he sent it for publication, believing it would act as a shockwave to physicists.
And that was what he wanted. You know, some people say, no, I want to be accepted. No, it's not that I want to be accepted. I want to open the door to the debate. That he felt was, with the Copenhagen interpretation, the orthodoxy had closed the door. There was a bit of controversy, but let's close the door. Let's all agree. We'll all come together. We'll come to Copenhagen. We'll all have some meetings. We'll have a lot of arguments, but in the end we'll agree, okay, we all believe the same thing. No, Bohm said, I want to open it up. So that's what he felt. And when this paper comes out, it'll cause great controversy. He's in Brazil, the paper appears, nothing. He hears nothing. Only heard from one person, De Bruyne's assistant. That's it. He heard nothing. And he was shocked. Why? Why is there nothing? Why aren't people writing to me? Why is there no controversy?
This deeply puzzled Bohm, and it was only later that he discovered the reason.
There was a student who had read Bohm's paper in Princeton when Bohm wasn't in the country, and took the paper to Oppenheimer and said, look, this is what Bohm wrote. Nobody refers to it. Nobody's discussing it. What's wrong with it? And gave the paper to Oppenheimer. 3 or 4 weeks later, Oppenheimer had not responded. So the student went to Oppenheimer and said, have you read the paper? And he said, yes. And he said, what's wrong with it? And Oppenheimer said, nothing. So the student said, what are you going to do about it? And Oppenheimer said, nothing, just ignore it.
But at the specific level, the Bohmian theory made a clear prediction about the non-locality of the world. What is non-locality? Non-locality is really, to put it in simple words, the profound discovery of the interconnectedness of the universe at the fundamental level of quanta. Now, that conflicts deeply right away with relativity theory, where it says, no, the speed of light is limited, everything is local, nothing can travel faster than the speed of light, so how could everything be instantaneously interconnected in the universe? And that's the big clash that we have today, and that's why also Bohm's theory of hidden variables, which are non-local, has really been rejected from the start, because there was this deep conflict with relativity theory, and nobody could get the two together.
It's only later he learned that after he'd left the United States in exile, that Oppenheimer had called a conference at Princeton, invited the leading physicists to discuss Bohm's paper and find a flaw in the argument. And at the end of the meeting, Oppenheimer said, if we cannot find an error in Bohm, we must all agree to ignore him. So word went out, ignore Bohm. And that's what Oppenheimer had done, ignore Bohm. And that was, for Bohm, a tremendous shock.
And that was the end of the discussion of that particular paper.
Oppenheimer wanted Bohm out of the way. He didn't want to be contaminated by Bohm. Bohm was politically suspect. He was politically suspect. He'd been before the House American activities. He'd been thrown out of the States. He wanted Bohm out of the way. He wanted nothing to do with Bohm. So I think that's it. Distance himself from Bohm.
Few people laughed. Few people cried. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Unhappy in Brazil and unable to travel, Bohm's only option was to take out Brazilian citizenship. And so he traveled to Israel, where he accepted a position at the Technion in Haifa. While in Israel, Bohm also met and married the woman who was to become his lifelong partner, Sarah Wolfson.
David had been exiled to Brazil after the House and American Activities business, and he was never happy there. You know, there were many problems, he felt. And then he was offered an opportunity in Israel. And of course it was a new state at the time, you know, I mean, and also of course he was Jewish. Maybe he saw this, you know, as a good opportunity. And he'd only been there a couple of weeks when he was invited to a party, and Cyril was present, and she spotted him from across the room and immediately was interested in this young man. And Cyril, she wanted to look after people, she liked to feed people, you know. She was very sociable and including everyone.
From Israel, Bohm moved to Bristol, and it was here that his fundamental ideas on the nature of reality began to take fresh impetus. In Bristol, Bohm left his hidden variable ideas behind and was now focusing on the fact that despite decades of work, physicists had been unable to reconcile quantum theory with Einstein's relativity.
He's left behind his hidden variables, he's left that behind, and now he's asking, why has there been decades of work on relativity and quantum theory, the two key theories of physics? Why are there two? Why is there not just one theory, one unified theory, as Einstein had hoped there would be? And so he's wondering, do we need a new theory? Is that the issue, or is it a completely new order to physics, a new approach? And that was what he began to think about, what he called the implicate order. We need a radically new order. So that was where his thinking was when he arrived in Britain.
At this time, Bohm also developed a new interest that was to have a deep impact on his life and his approach to science. As we have seen, quantum physics has long been concerned with the process of wave function observation. And Bohm was very much aware that depending on the conditions of an experiment, that electrons would behave differently depending on what was being observed.
When I was younger, I felt that in the beginning that science would surely be a source of benefiting mankind, and I had no question about it. I began to feel that something beyond science would be needed to approach this question, you see, that science alone could not guarantee that it would be used for benefiting mankind, the scientific impulse. In the beginning, I thought it would, just truth alone. Right? Then I began to look into philosophy and Eastern and Western and so on, and some people with religious ideas. I mean, just simply looking at it when I was in Bristol in England. And my wife and I used to go to the public library, and she discovered a book by Krishnamurti, and she read in there the words, the observer and the observed. And I had been interested in that because in quantum mechanics that is a key question, in the sense that because of this undivided wholeness, the two cannot be separated.
And she opened the book, and in it immediately saw references to things with regard to the observer and the observed. And she was startled because that's what David was working with in physics. And Cyril is trying to understand, how could this be that this Indian philosopher is also talking about the observer and the observed?
In quantum physics, in the study of the behavior of the electron, you have this very mysterious property that the very act of observing the electron changes it in such a way that there's a link between the apparatus of observation and what is observed. And Krishnamurti made a similar statement about events in the psychological field, which is that the act of observing something inwardly, some emotion or some attitude or whatever, the very seeing of it changes it, so that the inward sense of an observer, myself, who's looking, is inextricably connected with whatever I'm looking at. And so Krishnamurti expressed that in sort of an aphoristic fashion by saying the observer is the observed.
Which in essence took the questions that David was working with in physics and flipped them into the human realm, the realm of human experience, human life, human difficulties. David felt that Krishnamurti was onto something of great importance that could help to complete the sense of wholeness that he was trying to bring to light with his work in physics.
Krishnamurti's approach aligned with Bohm's own views on the nature of thought, of reality, and on the nature of consciousness in particular, seen as a coherent whole, which is never static or complete, but a continuous process of enfolding and unfolding. Both Bohm and Krishnamurti questioned their respective backgrounds, ultimately rejecting the orthodoxy they had once felt would provide answers to humanity's big questions.
In his early life, he was kind of adopted by this organization called the Theosophical Society, which discovered him when he was a 14-year-old boy on the beach in South India. And they predicted that he was going to become, this great, what they called world teacher and bring a new kind of consciousness to mankind. And they cultivated him and nourished him in this role. But somewhere about the age of 25, 27, maybe a little bit earlier than that, he began to seriously question all of this and find it very limiting, similarly to the way Bohm had found the scientific orthodoxy to be limiting.
It was at Brockwood Park that Bohm and Krishnamurti entered into a series of conversations whose themes covered the ending of time, the nature of mind, cosmic order, and much more over a 25-year period.
From Krishnamurti's perspective, it was very important for him because he felt as though he had a tremendous reservoir of insights to share with the world, but he felt like he couldn't necessarily bring it out by himself. He needed people to ask him. He needed people to dig and to question him. And of all the people he ever met, Bohm was the best at that. And I think Bohm, to some extent, formed a similar function for Krishnamurti because Krishnamurti could raise questions with him that might not occur in another context. For example, in the series that they did together that was published as The Ending of Time, Krishnamurti raises this question.
If humanity has taken a wrong turn.
It must have done so for a long time ago, I think.
And Bohm immediately starts talking in terms of events which occurred within the last 2,000 or 3,000 years or 5,000 years. And Krishnamurti goes, no, much longer. He's thinking in terms of evolutionary time, something really deep in the evolutionary development of consciousness. And so they explore this together, and they come up with a lot of interesting observations about that.
So this may be one of the barriers to the whole thing, that people, that behind the ordinary everyday thought, there is a deeper thought of mankind, which is that these qualities, that we're all divided, and these various qualities either belong to us or don't belong to us.
Quite.
And then we compare.
It's a fragmented mind that invents all this.
Yes, well, it has all been invented, but now we have picked it up verbally and non-verbally from childhood and by implication.
Implication, quite.
And therefore it pervades, it is at the ground of our thoughts, you see, of all our perceptions. And so this has to be questioned, you see.
We have questioned.
Yes.
I mean, we have questioned that grief is not my grief, grief is human.
Yes, but how are people to see that? Because a person caught in grief feels that it's his grief, you see. I mean, doesn't that seem right?
Yes, sir. I think it is because partly of our education, partly our society, tradition.
But it's also implicit in our whole way of thinking.
The whole way of thinking, quite right. So,
but then we have to jump out of that, you see.
Yes.
But perhaps we can see that love is not personal. Love does not belong to anybody any more than any other quality does.
Earth is not English Earth or French Earth. Earth is Earth.
You see, and I was thinking of an example in physics that, say, if a scientist or chemist is studying an element such as sodium, you see, it's not that he studies his sodium and somebody else studies his sodium. And they somehow compare notes.
Quite. Sodium is sodium.
Sodium is sodium universally.
Yes.
And if we have to say love is love universally, right? Essentially, the point made by Krishnamurti was that the problems of mankind originate in thought itself, in consciousness itself, you see. And as previous to that, I'd grown up believing that poverty was the main problem of mankind, and science would help me eliminate that. And I could see that no matter how far science went, it probably wouldn't, and even if it did, it wouldn't really it wouldn't really make mankind happy.
Krishnamurti was very concerned with conflict, inwardly, and conflict between people and the resolution of conflict. He had very, very few statements that he would have characterized as a law, but there's one statement that he made repeatedly and said was a law. I call it Krishnamurti's law. He says, where there's division, there must be conflict.
I remember I once asked Bohm that, so what do you think was the main contribution of Krishnamurti? And if I remember it correctly, Bohm said something like that. Krishnamurti kind of pointed out that thought is an actual movement in our lives. It's a physical movement, physiological movement, and it has a tremendous power. It's behind almost all our problems. Of course, we have some problems, like the meteorite that we haven't caused, other natural disasters. But many problems actually originate from the mind.
And we have to give attention to that manner in which thought is participating and shaping what we observe in order to understand how our whole mind is working, especially with respect to conflicts which occur between you and me, between my country and another country, and also conflicts which occur inwardly.
Be aware of our thoughts in this way. The mind could also be quiet. And there, then, of course, what Krishnamurti was suggesting that if you are able to be quiet, the deeper layers of reality might open up for you.
So in that state of mind, the mind is not just blank, or not doing anything. It's very active. The thinking process doesn't have to do with thought or recognition or knowledge, but is in a state of just perception, awareness, attention. Maybe you could even say receptivity to truth.
I think there might have been many reasons Bohm was drawn to Krishnamurti. The ones that are apparent to me is that Bohm perceived the wholeness of life. He perceived life as one indivisible whole, including nature, including consciousness. And in Krishnamurti, he found someone who also had this notion.
Krishnamurti, who was actually addressing the separation of the observer and the observed, in the same way as the wholeness in quantum theory was saying you can't make a separation between the system that you're looking at and the apparatus, which is the old traditional way of doing it, that somehow these things formed a whole. But rather than saying you can't develop concepts for it, what David was trying to do was to develop concepts. Now, to develop those concepts, you can't develop it within the scientific context. You've got to go outside to a wider set of concepts. And he found in Krishnamurti a way of discussing this more general question.
I remember one day we were here in Italy and he said to me, do you think I should give up doing physics and just devote myself to Krishnamurti? And my reply was, can a fish exist outside the goldfish bowl? So but that was it. He was that extreme that maybe he should devote himself completely to having his own brain transformed.